In the summer of 1941, the Crimean Peninsula emerged as a vital objective within the wider conflict on the Eastern Front. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union on 22nd of June, Adolf Hitler's strategic directives emphasized control over Ukraine's agricultural and industrial heartlands, as well as the Black Sea ports that linked the region to wider supply networks. Sevastopol, the heavily fortified base of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, represented both a military threat and a potential prize. From this harbor, Soviet naval and air forces could disrupt Axis logistics across the Black Sea and threaten advancing German and Romanian formations in southern Ukraine. Its capture promised to secure maritime routes, eliminate a bastion of Soviet resistance, and free resources for further operations toward the Caucasus. For Romania, a nation that had joined the Axis in hopes of regaining territories lost in 1940, Crimea and Sevastopol carried a more immediate significance. Romanian leader Marshal Ion Antonescu viewed participation in the campaign as essential to demonstrating loyalty to Germany and ensuring Bucharest's influence in post-war settlements. Romanian divisions were already heavily engaged in the battles of Bessarabia and southern Ukraine, where the armies of General Ion Antonescu fought alongside the German 11th Army under General Erich von Manstein. As the Axis lines extended deeper into Soviet territory, the question of supply and reinforcement became increasingly pressing. The Black Sea offered an avenue to support operations in Crimea, but it also exposed Axis convoys to Soviet naval and air attacks. Maintaining supply links across the peninsula itself, with its rugged terrain and limited infrastructure, posed further challenges that would soon fall heavily on Romanian troops. The Soviet leadership, aware of Sevastopol's strategic importance, had long prepared the city for a possible siege. Fortifications around the port stretched for kilometers, including reinforced concrete bunkers, underground command posts, and coastal artillery capable of covering approaches from both land and sea. The garrison of the separate coastal army, supported by Black Sea Fleet personnel, numbered more than 100,000 by late 1941, with heavy guns, tanks, and ample stockpiles of ammunition. Soviet intelligence underestimated the scale of Axis logistical preparations, but recognized that any attempt to storm the city would require sustained supply lines vulnerable to disruption. Public sentiment in the Axis and Soviet spheres also played a role. In Germany, propaganda celebrated the rapid advances across Ukraine, creating expectations of swift victories. In Romania, state-controlled media emphasized the liberation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, but remained cautious about projecting a narrative of conquest in Crimea. Many Romanian soldiers, already exhausted from weeks of marching and combat, faced deployment into a theater that demanded both endurance and sacrifice. In the Soviet Union, official statements highlighted the heroism of defenders and the determination to hold Sevastopol at all costs, casting the city as a symbol of resistance. By autumn 1941, the stage was set for a prolonged confrontation. Axis command required not only troops but also a functioning system of supply to maintain pressure on Sevastopol. Romania, lacking the mechanized resources of Germany, contributed divisions that bore much of the burden of logistical security, guarding convoys, maintaining lines across the Crimean Peninsula, and sustaining the flow of food, ammunition, and equipment to the front. The commitment of Romanian forces in this role would come at a high cost, shaping both the course of the siege and the collective memory of Romania's wartime experience. This was the prelude to one of the most demanding campaigns of the Eastern Front, in which military strategy, political ambition, and human endurance converged on the rocky hills and fortified bays of Sevastopol. The outcome would depend as much on the ability to sustain supply lines as on battlefield strength, and Romania's divisions would find themselves at the very center of this struggle. The opening phase of the Crimean campaign unfolded in October 1941, when the German 11th Army, reinforced by Romanian divisions, crossed the narrow Perekop Isthmus into the peninsula. This strip of land, only a few kilometers wide, served as the gateway to Crimea and was heavily fortified by the Soviet 51st Army. The defenders, numbering around 1,000 troops with artillery and armored support, sought to delay the Axis advance long enough to organize a coherent defense of Sevastopol and the interior. The attackers, with approximately 18,000 men, including Romanian infantry and cavalry formations, concentrated firepower and aerial bombardments to pierce the defenses. Romanian units, particularly the 3rd and 4th Armies, were integrated into the operational plans, tasked with securing flanks, maintaining lines of communication, and participating in the assault. At Perekop, Romanian infantry suffered heavy losses in frontal attacks against entrenched Soviet positions. Despite the high cost, coordinated German-Romanian efforts eventually forced the Soviet withdrawal deeper into Crimea. By late October, Axis forces pushed southward, exploiting mobility along the roads towards Sevastopol, the administrative center of the peninsula. The Soviet command responded by implementing a strategy of delaying actions. Defensive lines were established at Ishun and along natural barriers such as the Sivash marshes. These positions bought valuable time for Soviet engineers and troops in Sevastopol to strengthen fortifications. Simultaneously, the Black Sea Fleet evacuated soldiers and materiel from Odessa, recently abandoned after a 2-month siege, and transported them to Sevastopol. This transfer added tens of thousands of fresh defenders and enhanced the garrison's capacity to resist. For the Romanian troops, the early battles in Crimea highlighted both the limitations of their equipment and the endurance required in the campaign. The Romanian divisions relied heavily on German artillery and air support, as shortages of heavy weapons limited their capacity for independent operations. Supply convoys moving along the peninsula's narrow roads faced attacks from Soviet aircraft and naval forces. Romanian soldiers often marched for days with inadequate logistical support, contributing to fatigue and attrition even before the decisive battles began. By November 1941, Axis forces had advanced to the outskirts of Sevastopol, but the rapid collapse of German lines before Moscow forced the diversion of reinforcements away from Crimea. This left the 11th Army and its Romanian allies with fewer resources for a final assault. Early attempts to storm the city in November met with stiff resistance and high casualties, underscoring the strength of Soviet defenses and the difficulty of the task. Romanian formations found themselves increasingly tied to the maintenance of supply lines stretching back across the peninsula, a responsibility that exposed them to constant attrition from raids, harsh weather, and overextension. The opening phase had thus defined the contours of the struggle. The Soviets had preserved their fortress, bolstered by reinforcements from Odessa and the Black Sea Fleet. The Axis, while achieving territorial gains, faced the prospect of a long and costly siege. Within this framework, Romanian troops assumed dual roles: combatants on the front lines and custodians of the fragile supply network that would dictate the tempo of the campaign. Their sacrifices in this opening phase foreshadowed the demands and losses yet to come. The strategic planning for the assault on Sevastopol evolved during the winter of 1941-42, shaped by the interplay of German high command decisions and Romanian commitments. General Erich von Manstein's 11th Army bore responsibility for operations in Crimea, but the allocation of resources reflected the wider priorities of the Eastern Front. With the main German effort concentrated before Moscow, Sevastopol was assigned fewer mechanized units and limited heavy artillery until later stages. This forced reliance on infantry, supplemented by Romanian divisions whose endurance and numerical strength became essential to maintaining pressure. For Germany, the strategic goal was unambiguous. The capture of Sevastopol would eliminate the Soviet Black Sea Fleet's primary base, secure maritime control, and free Axis troops for advances into the Caucasus in 1942. Operational planning emphasized encirclement, systematic reduction of fortifications, and sustained aerial bombardments. The Luftwaffe's 8th Air Corps was tasked with neutralizing Soviet coastal batteries and disrupting supply routes, but weather and distance reduced effectiveness. Logistics became a decisive concern. Every ton of ammunition, fuel, and rations had to be hauled across a peninsula with poor infrastructure, where Soviet air and naval forces continued to strike at convoys. Romania's strategic calculus was intertwined with these objectives, but also distinct. Marshal Ion Antonescu recognized that Romania's standing within the Axis depended on visible contributions to major operations. Thus, Romanian divisions, such as the 1st Mountain Brigade and elements of the 4th Army, were deployed to Crimea, even though the country's industrial base could scarcely supply them with sufficient heavy weaponry. Romanian staff officers coordinated closely with German planners, but often found their units relegated to secondary roles, particularly guarding flanks, supply depots, and lines of communication. These assignments, though less celebrated, carried enormous risks. Isolated garrisons faced Soviet counterattacks, while convoys moving through mountain passes were vulnerable to ambushes and air raids. On the Soviet side, strategic planning revolved around exploiting Sevastopol's fortifications and the logistical advantages of naval resupply. The separate coastal army, supported by Admiral Filip Oktyabrski's Black Sea Fleet, received continuous reinforcement by sea, despite Axis attempts at blockade. Soviet doctrine emphasized defense in depth, with successive fortified zones designed to absorb Axis assaults while conserving manpower for counterattacks. The political dimension was also significant. Joseph Stalin ordered that Sevastopol be held at any cost, elevating its defense to a matter of national prestige. Soviet propaganda broadcast images of determined defenders, framing the city as a bastion that tied down Axis forces and bought time for the Red Army to recover elsewhere. The disparity in resources shaped operational expectations. German planners calculated that a concentrated assault with sufficient artillery could break Soviet defenses in weeks. However, logistical assessments revealed that bringing heavy siege guns, such as the 600mm Karl mortars and the 800mm Dora railway gun, required months of preparation. Romanian units, lacking comparable weaponry, could contribute manpower, but relied heavily on German artillery to achieve breakthroughs. This imbalance influenced the division of labor. While German formations prepared the main assault sectors, Romanians assumed responsibility for guarding extended rear areas, securing captured Soviet supply dumps, and ensuring the steady flow of material to the front. Propaganda on both sides underscored the importance of supply. Axis communications portrayed the campaign as a test of endurance, highlighting cooperation between German and Romanian troops. In Romania, newspapers presented the deployment as evidence of the nation's indispensable role in the Axis alliance, even as casualty lists grew longer. In the Soviet Union, radio broadcasts celebrated successful naval convoys and emphasized that the defenders remained well supplied despite Axis claims of blockade. This war of narratives reinforced morale, but also obscured the material hardships faced by soldiers. Romanian infantry endured shortages of winter clothing, food, and medical supplies, while Soviet troops, though bolstered by fleet deliveries, faced overcrowding, disease, and the strain of continuous bombardment. By early 1942, the strategic context had crystallized. The Axis prepared for a methodical siege, constrained by logistical bottlenecks and the diversion of resources to other fronts. Romania's role, though less visible in battlefield headlines, became vital in sustaining operations through control of supply lines. The Soviets, entrenched and resupplied from the sea, planned to outlast the attackers until broader counteroffensives elsewhere could relieve pressure. In this balance of strategy and planning, the fate of Sevastopol and the toll on Romanian divisions was set to be decided not only by weapons, but by the capacity to endure the demands of supply. The first direct clashes around Sevastopol began in late 1941, when Axis forces sought to probe the fortress defenses and exploit their initial momentum from the Perekop and Ishun breakthroughs. The geography of the region dictated the character of combat. Sevastopol's approaches were defined by rocky hills, deep ravines, and a system of coastal fortifications constructed over decades, reinforced with barbed wire, minefields, and underground bunkers. These natural and man-made defenses created a formidable barrier for advancing infantry. German and Romanian troops soon discovered that the methods that had succeeded in open country battles of Ukraine were ineffective against this layered system. The Axis High Command launched their first assaults in November 1941, with the German 11th Army supported by Romanian formations advancing from the north and east. The attacks were intended to overwhelm the outer defensive belts before the onset of winter. Romanian infantry, particularly the 1st Mountain Brigade, participated in difficult uphill battles against entrenched Soviet positions near Balaclava and Inkerman. Casualties mounted rapidly. Poorly equipped for mountain warfare in winter, Romanian units lacked sufficient mortars and heavy artillery, forcing reliance on German batteries for covering fire. In one sector, battalions advancing across exposed ridges suffered losses exceeding a third of their strength in a matter of days. Soviet defenders, drawing on reinforcements from Odessa, fought tenaciously. The separate coastal army, reinforced by sailors from the Black Sea Fleet, established strong points that resisted repeated bombardment. Coastal artillery, including 305mm naval guns embedded in concrete emplacements, inflicted heavy losses on Axis positions and disrupted supply columns moving along the narrow approaches. Soviet counterattacks, launched at night or in fog, struck at Romanian detachments guarding supply routes, forcing continual redeployment and stretching their manpower. Civilian populations were not spared the consequences of this fighting. The city of Sevastopol, with a pre-war population of nearly 11,000, had been transformed into a fortress zone. Thousands of civilians were conscripted into labor battalions, digging trenches, repairing fortifications, and assisting in medical services. For Romanian soldiers advancing into surrounding villages, encounters with civilians often brought logistical challenges. Requisitioning food and shelter risked alienating the population, while shortages at the front meant supplies had to be taken locally. Soviet authorities evacuated some inhabitants by sea, but many remained trapped, enduring bombardments and shortages. Morale fluctuated on both sides during these initial engagements. Among the Axis troops, the expectation of a quick capture faded as casualties rose and the scale of Soviet resistance became clear. Romanian diaries and reports noted frustration at the lack of adequate artillery and the heavy burden of supply duties. Yet, propaganda in Bucharest highlighted cooperation with German forces and portrayed the campaign as a continuation of the liberation of Bessarabia. In Sevastopol, defenders were encouraged by successful resistance, but the intensity of Axis bombardments and shortages of housing and sanitation facilities strained endurance. Disease spread in crowded shelters, compounding the human toll. By early December, the first Axis assault had been repelled with significant losses. Estimates suggest that the German 11th Army and its Romanian allies suffered over 2,000 casualties in these early attempts, while Soviet defenders also recorded heavy losses but retained control of their defensive belts. The failure to take Sevastopol quickly had strategic implications. The Axis would now have to commit to a prolonged siege through the winter, relying on fragile supply lines across Crimea. For the Romanians, this meant an even greater share of responsibility in securing rear areas, protecting convoys, and reinforcing depleted German units at the front. The opening clashes thus established the pattern of the campaign, relentless frontal assaults meeting stubborn defense, with supply lines and endurance becoming as critical as battlefield maneuvers. Romanian divisions, though often overshadowed by German formations and official communiques, bore an essential and costly role in this phase, absorbing attrition, maintaining the flow of supplies, and holding vulnerable sectors against Soviet raids. The siege of Sevastopol was no longer a swift offensive, but a grinding confrontation that would test the resilience of all who fought and lived within its shadow. As winter deepened in late 1941 and early 1942, the siege of Sevastopol escalated into a prolonged crisis that tested both attackers and defenders. The German 11th Army, reinforced by Romanian divisions, confronted an adversary that was not only entrenched, but also continually resupplied by sea. Despite heavy bombardments, Soviet resistance remained resilient, forcing the Axis to adapt to conditions for which their original plans had not accounted. For the Axis, the crisis emerged from multiple directions. Severe weather hampered mobility, supply lines stretched across snow-covered roads, and ammunition shortages grew acute. Romanian formations, often placed in rear guard or security roles, now face the dual challenge of maintaining fragile communications and fending off Soviet raids that cut into convoys. In several instances, Romanian detachments lost entire wagon trains to ambushes, depriving the front of food and fuel. The weight of attrition became evident as frostbite, malnutrition, and exhaustion added to combat losses. At the same time, Soviet commanders recognized the opportunity to exploit Axis vulnerabilities. In December 1941, the Red Army launched the Kerch Feodosiya landing operation, bringing nearly 4,000 Soviet troops onto the eastern Crimean coast. This bold maneuver threatened to encircle Axis forces in the peninsula. German and Romanian units were forced to divert men and materiel away from Sevastopol to contain the new front. Romanian divisions bore much of this strain, holding extended defensive lines along the coast under difficult conditions. Reports from Romanian staff noted constant shortages of artillery shells and inadequate winter clothing, yet these units managed to prevent a breakthrough until German counterattacks stabilized the situation in early 1942. Inside Sevastopol, the crisis was experienced differently. Soviet morale was bolstered by the successful amphibious landings, which demonstrated that the fortress was not isolated. Supplies and reinforcements continued to arrive by sea despite Axis aerial bombardments. Yet life for the civilian population remained harsh. Food rationing became increasingly strict, with daily allowances falling to bare minimums. Civilians shared bomb shelters with soldiers, contributing to overcrowding and the spread of disease. Propaganda emphasized endurance and sacrifice, framing the hardships as part of a broader struggle for survival. Politically, the failure to quickly capture Sevastopol created tension within the Axis alliance. German leaders pressed for intensified efforts, while Romanian officials grew concerned about the disproportionate losses their divisions sustained in secondary but essential roles. Bucharest's reports highlighted the high casualty rates among mountain troops and cavalry brigades, which had been deployed in rugged terrain, unsuited to sustained operations without mechanized support. The Romanian government nonetheless continued to commit forces, aware that withdrawal or hesitation could weaken its standing with Berlin. For the Axis soldiers, especially the Romanians, the crisis phase underscored the precarious balance between survival and duty. The burden of maintaining supply lines meant that even when not directly engaged in assaults, units endured continual attrition. Soviet raids on depots, Luftwaffe shortages in providing air cover, and logistical bottlenecks turned every march and convoy into a potential battle. The cumulative effect was a steady erosion of strength before decisive operations had even begun. By the end of winter 1941-42, both sides faced exhaustion, yet the siege showed no sign of resolution. The Soviet defense had proven effective enough to stall the attackers, while Axis determination kept the city under pressure. Romania's divisions remained deeply involved, sacrificing men and resources in roles that were less visible than the German assaults but no less vital. This escalation phase revealed the structural strains of the campaign, a fortress too strong for quick conquest, and an alliance dependent on overextended partners to sustain its ambitions. The crisis set the stage for the most intense fighting still to come. The peak of the Sevastopol campaign came in the spring and summer of 1942, when the Axis command resolved to concentrate overwhelming force to finally reduce the fortress. After months of attritional fighting, General Erich von Manstein secured reinforcements, including some of the heaviest artillery ever deployed in modern warfare. The German 11th Army was reinforced with super-heavy siege guns, such as the 600mm Karl mortars and the 800mm Dora railway cannon, designed specifically to demolish concrete fortifications. Alongside these, hundreds of medium and heavy guns were massed to blanket Soviet positions with constant bombardment. For the Romanian divisions, the new phase of operations brought both relief and renewed sacrifice. While the Germans led the main assaults, Romanian units were assigned to protect the siege artillery, secure the flanks, and hold captured ground against counterattacks. The decisive offensive began on 7 June 1942 with a bombardment that lasted days and consumed hundreds of thousands of shells. The Axis fielded approximately 2,000 to 4,000 men, of whom around 75,000 were Romanian, facing some 6,000 Soviet defenders. The firepower imbalance was immense. Romanian troops, tasked with advancing after the bombardments, reported the landscape transformed into shattered trenches and smoking craters. However, Soviet defenders fought on from underground bunkers and secondary positions. In sectors near Balaclava and the Sapun Ridge, Romanian infantry took part in grueling assaults against strongpoints that had survived even the heaviest artillery fire. For the Soviet garrison, the peak of the siege meant unrelenting pressure from every direction. Bombardments destroyed hospitals, water supplies, and much of the civilian housing. Yet morale remained bolstered by propaganda and by the visible determination of the Black Sea Fleet, which continued to attempt supply runs despite mounting losses to Axis aircraft. Soviet commanders shifted reserves from one crisis sector to another, making the most of limited manpower. The defenders used tunnels and subterranean command centers to withstand bombardments and coordinate counterattacks, prolonging resistance beyond what the Axis had initially expected. Romanian troops faced severe tests during this phase. At Severnaya Bay and in the approaches to Inkerman, Romanian mountain and cavalry units were ordered to clear trenches and hold captured ridges under constant Soviet artillery fire. These operations, often conducted with inadequate cover, led to high casualties. The lack of sufficient medical evacuation systems exacerbated losses, as wounded soldiers sometimes lay exposed for hours before relief could reach them. Reports from Romanian field hospitals indicated that disease and exhaustion further weakened the divisions, even as they were pressed into continuous combat and security operations. Civilian suffering also reached its peak. By mid-1942, the population of Sevastopol endured near total devastation. Food supplies dwindled despite naval resupply, and rationing fell to levels insufficient for long-term survival. Bomb shelters were overcrowded, and the city's infrastructure, already battered in 1941, collapsed under renewed bombardments. Civilians were mobilized to assist in transporting ammunition, digging secondary trenches, and caring for the wounded. From the Axis perspective, the persistence of civilian labor in support of the garrison meant that every victory was slower and costlier. Politically, the scale of the operation attracted attention across Europe. German propaganda celebrated the deployment of the massive siege artillery as evidence of technical superiority, while Romanian officials emphasized their soldiers' participation in the decisive campaign. However, the reality at the front told a more complex story. Romanian troops were critical to maintaining the siege lines and preventing Soviet breakthroughs, but their losses mounted without the same recognition as German achievements. Within Romanian military circles, frustration grew at the high cost in men and materiel, though Antonescu's government continued to stress loyalty to Berlin. By late June 1942, Axis forces had broken through successive defensive belts and reached the heart of the fortress. The fall of key positions, such as Fort Stalin and the Sapun Ridge, signaled that the Soviet garrison could no longer hold out. Romanian divisions were ordered to secure rear sectors and participate in mopping up operations as German units pressed into the city. The intensity of fighting at this peak stage left both armies exhausted, but the Axis finally achieved the breakthrough they had sought for months. For Romania, the cost was measured not only in thousands of casualties, but in the enduring memory of a campaign in which their troops bore essential, yet under-recognized burdens during the most destructive phase of the siege. As the siege dragged into its final weeks, both sides adapted their methods of survival and resistance. For the Soviet defenders, adaptation meant improvising with dwindling resources, while for the Axis, particularly the Romanian divisions, it meant developing ways to sustain extended positions under constant pressure. The struggle became one not only of weapons, but of endurance, as innovation and resilience determined how long soldiers and civilians could withstand the conditions. Inside Sevastopol, Soviet commanders reorganized their battered units into smaller, more mobile detachments, capable of counterattacks in ravines and ruins. With ammunition running low, many batteries rationed shells to a few per day, relying increasingly on mortars, grenades, and close-quarters combat. Sailors of the Black Sea Fleet, who had been trained for naval service, were deployed as infantry in the most threatened sectors, reinforcing exhausted rifle regiments. Improvised armored trains and hidden artillery pieces were shifted along tunnels and camouflage tracks, allowing them to surprise Axis formations that assumed they had silenced all heavy guns. Civilians also adapted. Workshops hidden underground continued repairing rifles and producing mines from salvaged materials. For the Axis, adaptation was equally critical. Romanian units, while lacking the heavy siege equipment of their German allies, compensated with experience in mountain and irregular warfare. Mountain brigades used infiltration tactics in rocky terrain, advancing by night to cut Soviet positions from the flanks. Romanian cavalry units, though less effective in direct assaults, patrolled extended rear areas and responded to Soviet landings or raids. In several documented cases, Romanian patrols detected Soviet infiltration groups attempting to reach ammunition dumps, preventing losses that could have jeopardized entire sectors. Logistics also demanded improvisation. When motor transport failed due to destroyed roads, Romanian soldiers relied on horses, oxen, and even manpower to move artillery shells to the front. The psychological toll became increasingly apparent. Romanian soldiers, often operating in exposed roles with limited recognition, struggled with fatigue and declining morale. Diaries and reports from the time described shortages of bread, the prevalence of lice and disease, and the strain of constant bombardments. Soviet defenders likewise endured exhaustion, yet their resolve was reinforced by the knowledge that each week of resistance delayed Axis plans for the summer campaign in the Caucasus. Propaganda on both sides sought to maintain morale. Axis broadcasts described imminent victory, while Soviet messages celebrated each successful counterattack as proof of eventual relief. Innovation extended to medical care and resource management. Romanian field hospitals, often overwhelmed, established makeshift facilities in captured villages. Lacking modern equipment, medics resorted to improvisations, such as using animal fat for dressings or melting snow for sterilization. Soviet medical staff faced similar shortages, treating hundreds of wounded daily with inadequate supplies. In some cases, surgeons operated underground by candlelight, relying on rudimentary instruments. Both armies endured high rates of amputation, infection, and untreated wounds, a grim reflection of the campaign's intensity. Naval operations added another layer of adaptation. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet continued to attempt resupply missions, despite increasing Axis air dominance. Romanian coastal and anti-aircraft units, working alongside German batteries, were tasked with intercepting these convoys. While Luftwaffe strikes sank several Soviet ships, others succeeded in delivering food, ammunition, and reinforcements. For Romanian troops guarding coastal batteries, this meant continuous vigilance and frequent firefights, as Soviet vessels bombarded shore positions during their approaches. By late June 1942, it was clear that Sevastopol could not hold indefinitely. Yet the measures adopted by both sides had prolonged the siege far beyond initial expectations. Romanian divisions had adapted to roles for which they had little preparation. Supply protection, mountain fighting, and counter-infiltration, while Soviet troops transformed the fortress into a labyrinth of resistance. These adaptations did not alter the eventual outcome, but they determined how long the struggle lasted and how heavy the human cost would be. For both Romanians and Soviets, resistance and adaptation became the defining features of life in the shadow of Sevastopol's crumbling defenses. The turning point of the Sevastopol siege came in the final week of June 1942, when the sustained Axis offensive, fueled by immense concentrations of artillery and air power, finally overwhelmed Soviet defenses. After nearly 8 months of resistance, the fortress began to collapse under the combined weight of bombardments, attrition, and the exhaustion of its defenders. For the Romanian divisions, this decisive phase marked both the culmination of their sacrifices and their deepest exposure to the consequences of prolonged siege warfare. The Axis had prepared their climactic assault with unprecedented firepower. Between 20 and 29 of June, the German 11th Army fired more than 2 million shells, targeting bunkers, tunnels, and gun emplacements. The Luftwaffe's the 8th Air Corps conducted thousands of sorties, dropping bombs not only on fortifications, but also on supply points and coastal batteries. Romanian divisions, holding the flanks and guarding artillery positions, endured near-constant counter-battery fire. In several sectors, Romanian infantry were ordered forward to exploit breaches created by German bombardments, encountering Soviet strongpoints that had survived underground. The resulting clashes were brutal, involving hand grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonet fighting in ravines and trenches. Soviet resistance remained determined, but the cumulative strain of months of fighting became insurmountable. Ammunition reserves dwindled to the point where artillery pieces fired only a handful of shells per day. Food supplies for both troops and civilians had nearly collapsed, with reports of soldiers surviving on minimal rations. Medical facilities, already overcrowded, broke down under the influx of wounded. The Soviet command attempted desperate counterattacks, but their depleted units lacked the strength to dislodge Axis footholds. By late June, Axis troops had seized key defensive landmarks, including the Sapun Ridge, which provided commanding views of the city and its harbor. For Romanian forces, the turning point was also measured in casualties. Units such as the 1st Mountain Brigade lost large portions of their manpower in repeated assaults on fortified ridges. Cavalry regiments, assigned to guard extended sectors, suffered from Soviet infiltration attacks that targeted ammunition and food depots. Despite these losses, Romanian troops remained embedded in the Axis siege system, preventing Soviet defenders from exploiting gaps and ensuring that German assaults remained supplied and reinforced. This role, though less visible in propaganda, was indispensable to the final victory. On 29th of June, Axis troops penetrated Sevastopol's inner defenses. Fighting raged inside the city, with Soviet defenders retreating from one improvised position to another. Romanian detachments secured, captured ground, and combed through destroyed neighborhoods for remaining strongpoints. The following days saw chaotic scenes as Soviet units attempted evacuation by sea. The Black Sea Fleet organized last convoys, but Axis aircraft and coastal batteries inflicted heavy losses. Thousands of Soviet soldiers and civilians were left behind when the final ships departed. By 4th of July 1942, organized resistance had ceased. Approximately 95,000 Soviet troops were taken prisoner, including wounded soldiers and hospital staff. The death toll on both sides was enormous. The Axis suffered around 35,000 casualties in the entire operation, of which a substantial share fell on Romanian divisions that had provided manpower, security, and logistical backbone throughout the siege. The fall of Sevastopol marked a dramatic shift in the Black Sea theater. For the Axis, it secured control over Crimea and freed forces for operations toward the Caucasus. For Romania, however, the turning point carried a different meaning. While Bucharest celebrated its contribution to a major victory, the sacrifices of Romanian soldiers highlighted the cost of alliance, high losses, limited recognition, and the burden of sustaining a campaign largely defined by German strategic interests. The turning point at Sevastopol thus represented more than the capture of a fortress. It was the moment when Romania's divisions paid the full price of their role in the campaign, achieving a place in one of the Axis' rare large-scale successes, yet doing so at a cost that foreshadowed the strain the war would continue to impose on the nation and its armed forces. The aftermath of the fall of Sevastopol in July 1942 was defined by both the triumph of the Axis and the devastation left behind for soldiers and civilians alike. The city, reduced to rubble after months of bombardment, became the scene of mass surrenders, forced evacuations, and logistical challenges that would haunt both victors and vanquished. For the Romanian divisions, the conclusion of the campaign did not bring immediate relief. Instead, they were tasked with stabilizing the captured territory, guarding tens of thousands of prisoners, and securing the vital supply lines that had been fought over so bitterly. The Soviet garrison had been effectively destroyed. Roughly 95,000 troops were captured, though many were wounded or incapacitated. Thousands more perished during the final assaults, buried in collapsed tunnels or killed in last stands within the ruins. Civilians, numbering perhaps 3,000 by the time of the city's fall, faced uncertain fates. Many were evacuated under Soviet control before the final collapse, but those remaining endured reprisals, forced labor, or displacement under Axis occupation. Romanian units were often stationed in devastated districts where the task of maintaining order was complicated by shortages of food, medical supplies, and shelter. For the Axis command, the capture of Sevastopol was a significant operational achievement. The elimination of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet's main base freed the Axis from constant naval harassment in Crimea and secured the flank for the summer offensive toward the Caucasus. However, the cost had been considerable, nearly 35,000 casualties, of which Romanian divisions accounted for thousands. Romanian reports listed losses in mountain brigades, infantry regiments, and cavalry units, emphasizing that many formations had been depleted by a third or more. Replacements were difficult to obtain, as Romania's manpower pool was already strained by commitments on multiple fronts. The handling of prisoners posed an immediate challenge. Camps had to be organized quickly, and Romanian units often assumed responsibility for escorting and guarding Soviet captives. With limited rations available, prisoner mortality was high in the weeks following the surrender. Romanian soldiers, themselves suffering from shortages, were placed in the uncomfortable position of distributing inadequate supplies while preventing escapes or uprisings. Axis propaganda portrayed the mass of prisoners as evidence of victory, but the logistical burden was real and immediate for the troops on the ground. Withdrawal and redeployment followed soon after. Many German units were transferred to support Operation Blue, the drive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Romanian formations, weakened but still needed, were also shifted gradually out of Crimea. Their departure left behind garrison forces to maintain control of the peninsula, where partisan activity and Soviet landings would continue to pose threats. For those Romanian divisions redeployed, the legacy of Sevastopol was a mixture of exhaustion and grim experience. Soldiers carried with them the memory of relentless bombardments, high casualties, and the responsibility of guarding supply lines that had become lifelines for the entire campaign. For the Soviets, the aftermath was equally complex. The loss of Sevastopol was a strategic blow, but the lengthy defense had achieved Stalin's objective of tying down Axis forces for months. The survivors, both military and civilian, endured displacement, captivity, or continued resistance through partisan warfare. Soviet propaganda framed the defense as a heroic sacrifice that had delayed the Axis and bought time for counteroffensives elsewhere, notably around Stalingrad, later in 1942. The narrative of heroic resistance overshadowed the devastation experienced by those left behind in ruins. In Romania, the capture of Sevastopol was initially celebrated as proof of the country's commitment to the Axis cause. Official communiques emphasized Romanian bravery and cooperation with German forces, though recognition of Romanian casualties was often muted in German reports. Families in Bucharest, Iași, and Cluj received news of heavy losses, sparking quiet discontent beneath the surface of public celebrations. Politically, Marshal Ion Antonescu maintained that these sacrifices secured Romania's standing in the alliance, but the reality of growing losses and limited rewards began to sow doubts among parts of the population and officer corps. Thus, the immediate aftermath of Sevastopol combined triumph and devastation. The Axis had achieved a rare, large-scale victory, but it had been purchased at immense cost. Romanian divisions, essential to the siege's outcome, emerged battered and thinned, their sacrifices overshadowed by German command. For the Soviets, the fall of the fortress marked a temporary defeat, but also a symbol of endurance that would resonate in the larger course of the war. For the civilians caught in between, the aftermath was neither victory nor defeat, but survival amid the ruins of one of the Eastern Front's most destructive campaigns. The legacy of the Sevastopol campaign and Romania's role in it extended far beyond the summer of 1942. The fortress had fallen, but its memory endured as one of the defining episodes of the Eastern Front. For Germany, the victory seemed to validate the costly concentration of resources, freeing the 11th Army to support Operation Blue. For the Soviet Union, the fall of Sevastopol became a rallying symbol, framed not as a defeat, but as a heroic stand that delayed Axis ambitions and allowed the Red Army time to regroup. For Romania, however, the significance was more complex. both a testament to sacrifice and a reminder of the costs of alliance with Berlin. Militarily, the campaign highlighted the decisive role of logistics and endurance in siege warfare. German heavy artillery and coordinated assaults had delivered the final blow, but without Romanian divisions securing the rear, guarding convoys, and absorbing counterattacks, the siege could not have been sustained. Estimates suggest that Romania committed approximately 75,000 troops to the campaign, suffering tens of thousands of casualties in the process. The losses eroded the strength of elite units, such as the 1st Mountain Brigade, which had gained valuable combat experience, but at the price of irreplaceable manpower. These sacrifices reinforced Romania's reputation as a committed Axis ally, yet they also exposed the limits of its capacity to sustain prolonged campaigns. Politically, the fall of Sevastopol temporarily bolstered Marshal Ion Antonescu's standing. In Berlin, Romania was acknowledged as a crucial partner, and in Bucharest, official propaganda celebrated the country's contribution to a major Axis victory. Yet beneath the surface, doubts lingered. Families mourning heavy casualties questioned whether the alliance with Germany served Romania's national interests. Officers noted the disparity between German recognition of their own units and the marginal acknowledgement of Romanian efforts. Over time, these frustrations would feed into broader dissatisfaction that grew as the war turned against the Axis. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Sevastopol entered wartime mythology. Soviet historiography emphasized the courage of the separate coastal army and the Black Sea Fleet, portraying the city as an example of endurance against overwhelming odds. The fact that Sevastopol held out for nearly 8 months, despite encirclement and constant bombardment, was used to demonstrate the resilience of the Soviet people. After the war, Sevastopol was granted the title of Hero City, ensuring its place in collective memory. Romanian involvement, by contrast, was rarely acknowledged in post-war narratives, either in the Soviet Union or in Romania, where the subsequent political regime sought to downplay the alliance with Germany. Civilians who had endured bombardments, starvation, and eventual occupation left behind a quieter but equally significant legacy. Their survival and labor during the siege underscored the total nature of the conflict, where the boundary between combatant and non-combatant blurred. For those deported, displaced, or subjected to reprisals after the fall, Sevastopol remained a memory of suffering rather than triumph. The destruction of the city, its port facilities, and its homes illustrated the broader devastation inflicted on Eastern Europe during the war. Historically, the campaign stands as an example of the contradictions within the Axis alliance. Romania, seeking to secure its territorial ambitions and prove loyalty, invested heavily in a campaign that served primarily German strategic objectives. The outcome delivered temporary prestige but imposed long-term costs on its army and population. The lessons of Sevastopol about the limits of alliance politics, the burden of attrition, and the underappreciated role of supporting armies resonate in scholarly analysis of the Eastern Front. In commemoration, the siege has been remembered differently across nations. In Germany, it was long cited as one of the Wehrmacht's technical and operational achievements, though overshadowed by later defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk. In Romania, memory of the campaign remained subdued after 1945, resurfacing only cautiously in post-communist historiography as part of a broader reassessment of the country's wartime role. In Russia and Ukraine, Sevastopol remains a symbol of sacrifice, its legacy tied to national narratives of resilience. The bloody Sevastopol supply line thus endures not only as a historical episode, but as a reminder of the multiple perspectives through which war is experienced. For German commanders, it was a victory. For Soviet defenders, a tragedy turned into legend. For civilians, a catastrophe. And for Romanian divisions, a costly demonstration of loyalty that left scars far deeper than the fleeting prestige it earned. In the wider course of the war, the campaign's significance lay in both its immediate outcome and its enduring lessons. That military triumph can coexist with human devastation, and that alliances built on unequal burdens often impose the heaviest costs on those least prepared to bear them.